Greetings, everyone, and a very warm welcome to this session. My name is Sara Bazoobandi. I'm a Marie Curie Research Fellow at the German Institute for Global and Area Studies and an associate with ISPI. Today's session, which is a part of the year-long initiative that will lead us to the 9th edition of Rome Med, the annual conference on the Mediterranean region, which is co-prompted by ISPI and the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation. That is a year-long process. That this year the meeting will take place on November 2nd, the 2nd and November the 4th in Rome. This event is Today's event is organized in partnership with the GIGA Institute and MENA OECD Governance Program. Welcome to you, everyone. The women have been striving for gender equality across the world, and the situation in the Middle East, North Africa region has remained unresolved. While incremental progress has been recorded, the pace does not really reflect the commitment to address the challenges across the region. Moreover, the progress has been spread sporadically and unequally amongst different countries, which is perhaps above all a reflection of the domestic dynamics on various cases and conditions. Laws, policies, and programming focused on gender equality are growing across the region. Women's representation in government and in national programming has increased, and many countries have established mechanisms and institutions that promote the rights and welfare of women and girls. Areas such as education and health have seen significant improvements in gender-related indices, both globally and in the region. And the special programs aimed at supporting women's and girls' rights and empowerment have accelerated in many countries in the region. Civil society, particularly women's and feminist civil society, have played a significant role in advocating gender equality in the region. But unanswered intersectional concerns about the situation of women and girls are further compounded by certain global and regional events, including political and economic upheaval, conflict, occupation, and the global COVID-19 pandemics. In this panel, our three distinguished speakers will share their perspectives on various aspects of these concerns. Our first speaker is Dr. Tatyana Teplova. She is the head of division and senior counselor for gender equality, justice, and inclusiveness at OECD's Public Governance Directorate. A very warm welcome to you, Tatyana, and thank you very much for joining us today. I made a passive reference to the significant impact of COVID-19 pandemic on women in the MENA region. I would like to invite you here today to shed some light on this matter through the perspective of your own work. I know you deal on a daily basis with the issue of governance, justice in the region. And I suppose the issue of protecting women against violence through good governance and having an effective justice system sits at the heart of the excellent work that you and your team do at OECD. So tell us, what are the effects of the COVID-19 crisis on violence against women, specifically physical violence across the region? How does the current situation look like? What are the post-pandemic challenges that women and girls in the region are facing? The floor is yours, Tatyana.
everybody. It really is a great pleasure for me to be joining you here today together with the distinguished speakers and my fellow panelists. So thank you again for inviting the OECD to join this conversation. Sara, as you said, in recent years, the OECD has been steadily advancing our work with the aim to really enhance capacities of governments to prevent and tackle violence against women, including in the MENA region. We are currently coming to the end of our work on the paper that assesses country approaches to tackle this issue in the MENA region and proposes a series of recommendations on how to strengthen the legal, policy, and institutional frameworks, how to adopt a perspective that puts the needs of survivors and victims of violence at the center of the services and of the government strategies, but then also how to improve justice and accountability mechanism in this space. So we know that violence against women is an epidemic phenomena across the world. Globally, nearly 1 in 3 women who have experienced physical and or sexual violence during their lifetime. And the picture is not that much different in the MENA region. Based on the data that is available to the OECD, even before the COVID-19 pandemic, it was estimated that approximately 1/3 of married women in the region had experienced some form of physical and sexual abuse. It should also be noted that due to underreporting of abuse and also due to the lack of data, especially when violence might be committed by members of the family, these figures are quite likely to be an underestimate. We also know that, unfortunately, the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, and then the subsequent confinement measures have had a devastating impact on women, leading to a significant increase in violence in all countries, often due to economic insecurity, forced coexistence with abusers, disrupted support, as well as disrupted law enforcement services. And even though these risk factors exist everywhere around the globe, we can see from the OECD work, because of course we work with the OECD member countries, with MENA countries, but also with many of our partner countries around the globe. These were heightened in the MENA region, often due to the strict social norms that can view men as the primary providers for their families. And here, economic obstacles and pressure that were preventing men from fulfilling their social roles are also thought to have caused some frustrations and led to increase the violence against women and girls. And overall, we see that the ability of governments in the MENA countries, but also more broadly around the globe, to respond to violence against women and girls was severely challenged during the pandemic. We also find that many governments were insufficiently prepared to promptly implement contingency strategies to protect women from violence, particularly in the emergency context that was installed by the pandemic. On the positive side, the crisis also created an opportunity for governments to better prevent and respond to violence in the future. We see that as a response to the urgency triggered by the global pandemic, there have been genuine and innovative attempts by the MENA governments to deal with this phenomena of violence against women and girls. And let me briefly highlight highlight just a few points here. First, we saw that the MENA countries have rapidly adopted their emergency response plans or adopted new plans to address or tackle the issue, the surge of the cases of violence, which, for example, was the case in Egypt that prioritized women's protection. In many countries, again, both in MENA and in OECD,
I think we have lost Tatyana. Sorry, I think there was some technical issues with Tatyana's connection. So until that is sorted, perhaps we just move on to the next speaker, so we save some time for Tatyana to finalize her remarks later when her connection is back. Our previous speaker correctly pointed out various important issues to do with socioeconomic conditions of women, and that how these conditions are contributed to violence against women. It is, of course, violence against women is a direct result of a staunch patriarchal character of the government and patriarchal culture across the region. As Tatyana correctly mentioned, men are perceived as the ultimate provider for their families. Therefore, the socioeconomic and maybe economic and financial dependence on women on their violent perpetrators that are often in the cases that Tatyana has studied and OECD has monitored are in fact the male members of these women and girls. So these economic dependence and financial reliance has played an important factor. So I would like to now invite our second speaker, Dr. Rana Hendy, to comment on these socioeconomic challenges. Rana is an assistant professor at School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the American University of Cairo. And she will shed some light on the question of socioeconomic participation of women in the region. How does the current space look like, and what are the key challenges? But before you start, Rana, I just wanted to apologize to Tatyana because there was an interruption with your line. We moved on to Rana, but we'll give you some extra time to finish your remarks. I'm really sorry about that. I wasn't sure how long would it take for you to reconnect. Thank you very much for your patience. Rana, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sara, very much. And let me first start by thanking you and thanking the organizers of this important webinar, actually, for putting this panel together to discuss such an important topic. So as a matter of fact, as you have mentioned when introducing this session, so the low levels of female labor force participation in the Middle East and North African region are well established. So we're talking about an average of around 20%. And when we're comparing this number to other regions like Latin America and the Caribbeans, the averages for female labor force participation are much higher, right? So we're talking about 50% for this other region. So as a matter of fact, the MENA region has the lowest female labor force participation. But on the other hand, data shows that when it comes to education and education attainment, there has been a closing of this gender gap for most MENA countries. So I'm thinking now about those graphs showing, the share of women and men completing secondary education and above, and how those shares are equalizing actually in the latest years. So the trends in female labor force participation are so flat despite those increases, significant increases in educational attainment and the falling gender gap in education, which of course implies wasted opportunities for growth and development. So I think the main question that I would like to focus on here is why are rapidly rising rates of educational attainment for women not translating into rapid increases in labor force participation. And there are a number of explanations for this in the literature on MENA. So one of them, as mentioned by Tatyana, our first speaker, the conservative gender norms, right? So women remain the main responsible of household related responsibilities and most of care work. But there are other reasons also that are related to the demand side of the market. So one of those reasons is the weak and the dependent private sector that is actually unwilling to assume the cost of women's reproductive roles. And of course, married women are more affected by this. The other reason I would like to mention is the shrinking of government and public sector jobs. So opportunities in the public sector have been reduced since the 90s. When governments of the region decided to go through those structural reforms that were imposed on most countries, and those actually implied privatization waves and so on, and public sector jobs were considered as the dream job for women, right? And when those jobs are no longer available for women, labor force participation has been either reduced or stagnant over the years. So in Egypt, just to give you an idea, more than 50% of employed women in the 90s were working in the government. And of course, this percentage has been going down since then. So we can summarize the obstacles that MENA women are facing into a number of main obstacles. The first one is being those cultural barriers. The second one being the primacy of the domestic sphere and the traditional division of labor between men and women. And the third being the labor market barriers. So as examples of labor market barriers, there is the fact that women-unfriendly regulations that result in higher costs to employ women, especially in the private sector. Adding to this, of course, the occupational segregation and the inhospitable workplaces. Again, this mostly implies to the private sector, and the absence or the high cost of childcare. So just to end my contribution here, not to take so much time. So my main argument here is that there is a need to create an opportunity structure that raises demand for women outside home, for work outside home. And governments in MENA also must start expanding sectors in which women are already disproportionately represented. Thank you very much. Over to you, Sara.
Thank you so much for your excellent presentation. Perhaps it's a very good opportunity now. I jump back to Tatyana, if I may, Burcu. I do apologize for putting you on hold because you got cut off right when you started speaking about Egypt. Now, we heard a little bit about Egypt and Egypt's economic environment and some of the challenges that women, especially entering labor force and having economic participation, are facing, which a lot of these are indeed shared across the region. These are not Egypt-specific issues. They are, you look at any country across the region, for sure, a good number of these issues and challenges also exist there. So I want to come back to you, Tatyana. You mentioned about the rise of gender violence as a result of, and that is, I think, the very interesting point to connect your presentation with Rana's comment, as a result of financial dependence of women, especially at the time of pandemic and confinement that was created by the pandemic. But you also said that there are some developments. Some countries across the region have come up with contingency plans, with plans of action to protect women. So talk us through some of these good news about the region. Back to you again.
Thank you, Sara, and I hope that my connection actually stays until the end of this event, at least. Indeed, there is quite some good news to share as well. We did see some progress across, again, both MENA and OECD countries in terms of preventing and addressing issues of violence. For instance, what we saw in the MENA countries is the growing commitment to actually be dealing with this issue by both adopting new laws, but also updating or adapting legal frameworks to prevent and prosecute different forms of violence against women and girls. Some measures that we have seen at the national level included the adoption of new regulations, and here I actually have in front of me some of the data or the list of countries that have reported adopting new legislation in this space. For instance, Algeria, Bahrain, the Kurdistan region of Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, Morocco, Saudi Arabia, and Tunisia. So the news is good that there is progress that we can see. For instance, also a concrete example that in 2017, the Jordanian and Lebanese parliaments repealed provisions in their penal codes that allowed rapists to marry their victims. We have also seen some progress at the international level as well. For instance, all countries in the MENA region have ratified the CEDAW Convention, the Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, and also have made commitments to implement the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action. There are also quite a few specific strategies and action plans that have been developed by governments to facilitate the implementation of the legislation, but also we see the establishment of new forms of coordination for the implementation of the legislation. For instance, interministerial coordination mechanisms, or also the cross-governmental coordination mechanisms, meaning mechanisms to facilitate work across levels of governments, particularly when we are talking about national, local government, but also the community levels. Efforts have been made to improve data collection and sharing, including the exchanges of data between the police, NGOs, shelters, hospitals, schools, and pharmacies. And what was also really interesting during the confinement periods or the pandemics is that there have been, I would say, unprecedented measures to change the attitudes of boys and men towards violence against women, and to raise their awareness both at the national but also at the local levels. And here, for example, the information that we have from Morocco and Lebanon, that they they've launched a national campaign to combat this issue by also sensitizing young people to violence against women. And then if we look at the region as a whole, we saw that Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, Morocco, the Palestinian Authority, and Tunisia have also collaborated with our sister institution, the UN Women, for the launch of a regional advocacy and behavioral change campaign, the Because I Am a Man. This campaign seeks to empower, to sensitize boys and men and promote positive masculinities. So overall, these developments do show that there is an increasing commitment of the MENA governments to actually be engaging in these issues. But then, of course, this is not to say that there are no gaps. There are indeed many remaining challenges and gaps, including underreporting of violence against women. And here I already mentioned a few primary factors such as social norms, economic dependency, and distrust. But of course, yes, happy to be talking about this in greater detail if there is time.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Happy to have you back again with us. Last but not least, Burcu, Dr. Burcu, Ucaray-Mangitli, a researcher at Göttingen University here in the same country as I'm based. Good to see you again, Burcu. She's done extensive research on the question of political participation of women in various case studies. So, Burcu, we talked so far about various challenges. At the heart of these challenges, on the happy note that Tatyana left us with was the improvement of a awareness situation and B, cooperation, coordination across the government. So ultimately, all of these efforts, the ones that are led by the domestic governments, very much depend on who is in the government, who sits at which council, who sits at what position. And I know that you've done excellent work on looking at the issue of participation, both in the substantive point of view and quantitative point of view, because the numbers always don't reflect indeed deep influence of women. So I don't want to keep the audience from your remarks any longer. Please talk us through the shared trends and challenges and perhaps success stories on this issue across the region.
Definitely, Sara. Thank you very much. And it's my privilege to participate in this panel alongside Rana and Tatyana, and thank you to organizers. Of course, the most important success story in the region is the overall increase in the proportion of women representatives in legislatures. The average representation of women has risen from 12% in 2011 to 18-19% presently. Compared to the global average, which stands at 26%, and for example, sub-Saharan African average at 23%, this progress is commendable. Countries like Egypt and Morocco are actually standing above this regional average. This rise can be attributed to many factors, some of which are, of course, case-specific, but overall we can say that the most important two factors are resilient grassroots feminist movements in these countries, as well as implementation of quota systems in 13 MENA countries. It's worth noting that countries without quota systems, such as Kuwait, Oman, Lebanon, have the lowest levels of women legislators. Turkey, for example, remains behind the regional average at 17% and does not have a quota system in place. If we turn to public support for women as leaders, we see that it is continuing to increase. According to Arab Barometer, in the last 16 years, a big shift in opinion of all age groups, all genders took place. More and more people think that women make better leaders than men. The only exception is Algeria, and we can talk about that case. Women's interest in running for political office is also increasing. In the 2022 elections in Lebanon, women running for office actually increased by 37%. Unfortunately, that meant only 2 more seats for women and 8 women in total. If we turn to critical actors, Dr. Emel El-Kubeishi has become the first speaker of the United Arab Emirates Parliament in 2015. In Tunisia, in 2019 presidential elections, for the first time, 2 women ran as candidates, and Prime Minister Necla Bouden was appointed by President Kais Saied in September 2021, becoming the first woman prime minister in the region. This, of course, came after Said suspended much of the constitution, asserted the authority to govern by decree, and curtailed the independence and powers of the position, which, according to some, is a good example of a glass cliff for women. However, the question arises here is whether the increase in women's representation in MENA parliaments translates into substantive changes. And based on our research with Dr. Senem Yildirim, as well as excellent work done by Dr. Merve Shalabi and Dr. Leyla El-Imam, we can say that there are still institutional barriers to the equal and effective political participation of women. MENA parliaments are gendered workspaces that do not provide the same opportunities to women MPs, such as learning, skill development, experience gathering, and legislative influence as their male counterparts. Our research on the Turkish parliament, for instance, reveals that women MPs predominantly appointed to less prestigious legislative committees that focus on quote-unquote feminine themes such as family, children, health, and education. They are rarely appointed to committees that deal with national security, defense, foreign policy, or justice. And they face challenges in assuming leadership positions in these committees that serve as gateways to higher echelons of political power. In fact, women's chances of getting re-elected decrease if they become chairs of any committee. On the other side, male legislators who work in prestigious committees learn the ropes fast, advance their political careers, and even become ministers. And this is not a finding unique to Turkey. In other comparative studies, we also see that gender-biased committee appointments are all around the MENA region, as well as vertical segregation. One example is a qualitative study from Iraq for the Committee on Women, Family and Childhood by Inas Abulsada Ali and her colleagues. And we see that this committee was exclusively comprised of women MPs, as if to point out the boundaries of acceptable policymaking by women. This repeats itself also in the ministerial positions. Despite the record number of women ministers in Tunisia and Egypt, they are often confined to ministries of social portfolios. So to sum up, progress is being made towards achieving critical mass in the MENA region, but it may take longer for women to have meaningful influence over policymaking due to institutional and cultural barriers that impede the effective participation.
Thank you very much. Excellent presentations, really appreciated. Well, just to recap what we said so far, and I'm hoping that more questions in the Q&A box will come through in the meantime. You all portrayed an excellent landscape of the current situation. 1 in every 3 women across the region experiences violence. Labor participation is around 20% in some countries, average 20% in some countries, even below that. The political participation is under 20% across the region. But you also highlighted, steps, quota systems to improve the political participation, the communication across agencies, and so on and so forth. So we see that there are some challenges and there are some positive outcomes. And I want to invite the speakers to think about policy recommendations, which are going to be the very last part of our panel. But in the meantime, I had a question coming from the Q&A box, and a question that I would like to specifically raise to Tatyana, if I may. And you can decide who goes first. The question that came from the audience, which I think was a very interesting one, is basically about the role of Asian economic powerhouses in the region. Traditionally, the non-oil producers across the region relied on foreign aid or foreign investment that came more from the Western world. And the oil producing countries dependent on exports income, which was directed towards West and increasingly towards the East, Eastern economic powerhouses over the past decade. There is a lot of conversation about the rise of influence of China in the region. And the question is specifically asked, what do you think that will play? How do you think play out? And how do you think that can influence the economic and political environment for women across the region? The next question I have for Tatyana is, can you talk about a little bit more in depth about the OECD initiatives to support, provide assistance for improving the situation of women? Because I know in your work, you are involved with a lot of these initiatives, but specifically if you have any examples of successful projects, or any kind of projects that is ongoing, would be highly appreciated. So on the China question, do we have a volunteer who wants to go first? Or whilst you are organizing your thoughts, Tatyana, would you mind taking the first go at my question, and then we'll come back to the other speakers so they will have some time to organize their thoughts?
Sure, of course, with great pleasure. Of course, our work is taking place as part of the broader cooperation within MENA OECD governance program, and the work that we do on gender equality, not only on violence against women, but on gender equality in the region, is guided by the MENA OECD platform on leadership, gender mainstreaming, and governance. And of course, in this platform or working group, if you wish, we have representation of both MENA governments, but then also our own member countries and partner countries, which and where cooperation takes place, both kind of through these multilateral exchanges, but then also followed by bilateral cooperation. In terms of some of the specific work streams, if you wish, let me maybe continue discussing a little bit the issue of violence, also minding the time that, of course, the OECD is a bit of a newcomer to this work, but actually in 2020, all of the OECD ambassadors have called upon the OECD to actually be cooperating with other international institutions and to help strengthening government capacities to actually address this issue. Because what we've heard through our surveys, through our conferences, that this is among the top priority areas for our member countries and our partners, including in the MENA region. So that's the reason why the OECD started this work. We launched recently a framework on governance practices to eliminate violence against women. We are finalizing a regional report on this topic, specifically focusing on the lessons learned for the MENA region. And actually at the OECD level, we will also be launching in June a flagship publication which actually builds on the work across the entire OECD on identifying good practices on what it takes to prevent and tackle violence against women and girls. So I will pause here, and then of course happy to come back on the recommendations as well.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So Rana and Burcu, I want you to feel free whether you want to start with commenting about the role of China, or you would rather leave that one for the next speaker, or I could have a go at trying to provide some input in that, and also about recommendation. So if you were to point out 1 or 2, 3 maximum bullet points to the policymakers in the region to address the issues that you discussed specifically in your presentation, what would you be advising them? So let us go in reverse order. Let's first give the floor to Burcu, and then we'll come to you, Rana, last. The floor is yours, Burcu. Please go ahead.
Okay, so I can start with the China question. Two points come to my mind. The first one is international financial institutions like World Bank and IMF, for example, even though they want to stay away from political issues like gender equality, they still have an interest in that, and they don't push gender equality, but they have funding for gender equality projects, so on and so forth. China's funding, private funding, as well as funding through AIIB, on the other hand, does not have much of attached conditionality. So that can be attractive to the MENA region governments if they want to avoid the issue of gender equality. The second thing that comes to my mind is that it can also help with economic growth outside of oil production industry, and that can open up, maybe related to Rana's presentation, new opportunities for women's economic empowerment, which is also related to women's political empowerment, of course, because one of the policy recommendations I want to make is related to this issue. A typical woman running for office in the MENA region is usually a member of a traditional political family or a relative of a political figure, a male figure, of course. And these women are trying to survive in the political system. And it's very hard to be change agents while at the same time conducting these alliances with the traditional conservative party systems. If women can have self-funding opportunities, if they can have campaign finance, they can bring their own thoughts, ideas, and interests to the political table. Another recommendation I would make is not just the electoral quota system, which we often talk about, but party-level quota system. One finding we arrived at is that there are no partisan differences in gender-biased committee appointments between rightist and leftist parties. They are similarly biased against women. One difference is for Turkey is HDP, People's Democracy Party, a smaller left-wing party based on Kurdish movement, and they have a 50% party-level quota system for women, which affects their committee appointments as well. They are increasingly appointing women also to prestigious committees. And similar party-level quotas are in place in, for example, in Egypt, Social Democratic Party has a 30% party level quota, so that can be an important contribution. And last but not least, structural barriers need to be demolished, and these structural barriers are sometimes can be very trivial. Putting political meetings at nighttime, having political meetings at in places where women cannot enter. Those are all important policy steps towards more political participation for women. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Burcu. Rana, to you, please.
So let me try to respond to the policy recommendation question. So during my intervention, I mentioned cultural barriers as one of the main obstacles to low female participation in labor markets in MENA countries. But the good news is that those cultural barriers can actually be overcome by a positive opportunity structure for women in the labor market. So what we need is greater job opportunity, more job opportunities in sectors that are female intensive. So let me take Egypt as an example. And I was looking at those economic activity occupations, but also sectors that are growing the most, you know, in the past 5 years in the case of Egypt. And construction happen to be one of the top growing sectors, right? But construction is not a female friendly. So the result was that, you know, despite the significant growth in that sector, women didn't have any more opportunities, right, in the labor market. So basically what we need is more opportunities in sectors that female are able to work in and want to work in. And that, of course, take into consideration all those points mentioned by the distinguished speakers here about, you know, having female-friendly jobs that take into consideration all those needs of women in the labor market.
Thank you so much. We have just about 1 minute left from our time. I just wanted to sincerely thank you again for your time today. It was a great pleasure. I really enjoyed the discussion. We had one final question about the role of EU and the effectiveness of EU initiatives for gender, addressing the issue of gender equality. And I think I would very much refer that answer to the same point that Burcu raised, that there are players, cooperators, partners that want to have these conditionalities attached to their cooperation, and there are those that who do not want to attach these conditionalities to their cooperation. So it's important to have those conditionalities in place to be able to then assess whether they are efficient or not. So having those conditionalities in place are quite important. Again, Burcu, you mentioned glass cliffs when you talked about political participation of women. And I think the same applies to remarks that was made by Rana and Tatyana. I do hope that next time when we sit around and review these issues again together, we would at least reduce the cliff to a big stone rather than a cliff. Thank you so much for your time. It was a pleasure.